Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bodega Ladies channel. And today we have a highly esteemed guest, the most amazing historian you'll ever meet in your life, Dr. Tiffany Gill. She is a contributor of Urban Apologetics, restoring Black identity with the gospel. This is what it looks like. A lot of you probably already have it. If you don't, make sure you pick it up. She wrote chapter 4, which is titled Black Church, Black Church History and Urban Apologetics. So go ahead and kick it off, Shawnee.
All right, Dr. Gill, thank you for joining us. I think we're all like geeked out. So before we dive into the interview, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Dr. Tiffany Gill?
Who is I? I'm wonderful. I'm glad to be here. I'm someone who knows grammar, but it's just an honor to be here among godly women who love the word, women who go hard after God, and just have this forum for lots of us to be in. And are you hearing feedback from me? Okay, hopefully we have a storm passing over Philadelphia, so I'm hoping it doesn't knock out the internet. But who am I? I am George and Helen Gill's baby girl. That's sort of my point of entry into the world. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, BK all day, every day. And I've lived in New York, and I lived in Texas, and now I'm here in Philadelphia, where I serve as a deacon and a leader in the SALT women's ministry team here at Epiphany Fellowship under the pastoring of Dr. Eric Mason, who edited this collection. I'm a history professor. I'm a nerd. I tell people I'm a history nerd. I'm a nerd in many ways. I'm a girl. Like the way I tell my students is I love school. And so I just never left. So I went to college, and then I went to grad school until I couldn't go anymore. And then after that, I started teaching at a university. So the Lord has really just done a work in my heart, in my life, around knowledge. And what's ironic, but the best part of me is that that Jesus came and rescued me, and he did it in graduate school. So there's a whole kind of way that my trajectory as a scholar and my life as a believer, how the Lord has just redeemed those things for his glory. And so I became a believer in my first semester in graduate school, which is a very unlikely place. But God is sovereign. And so my entire walk, my early walk and graduate school all came together. And so I just want to glorify him in all that I do. So that's who I am.
Nice. So you said that you are somebody who really enjoys knowledge. So how did you narrow it down to history? How did that become your field of study?
Yeah, I was one of those undergraduates, and I tell parents all the time, like, if your child doesn't know what they want to major in, like, they'll be fine. I changed my major probably every other month from like sophomore to junior year. I went to Georgetown University in DC for undergrad, and I came in as a government major. I was going to be an attorney. I was going to be a civil rights attorney. I wanted to head the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I was going to be a lobbyist. I had this whole plan. And I got there, I realized that I was pursuing law because I didn't know what else. Like, I didn't grow up in a family where people were professors. I'm part of first generation college. My parents didn't go to college, even though they were really supportive in my education. And so I chose law because I like to talk, and I knew I wasn't good at medicine or science or any of those things. I like to read and talk. And really it was a professor who I worked as a work study student for. And really the sovereign move of God, where two professors in 1 week came up to me after leading class discussion and said, Tiffany, have you ever thought about being an academic, being a professor? I was like, no, professors don't make no money. This is before I was a believer, but that's what I said, which isn't entirely untrue. But by the time the second person asked, I was like, maybe I should think of it. So first it was kind of coming into the realization that I wanted to pursue a life of the mind, of research and writing and teaching, which really brought together everything I loved. And history, I say I became a historian because I came from a family where I don't know much of my family's history. My father was an immigrant from Trinidad, the West Indies, and came to this country illegally. And his parents died when he was young. And so he didn't have a lot of connection. My mother's side of the family in Georgia, when I would ask them questions, they're like, why do you want to know about them bad days? Like, go play outside. And so I think I became a historian because I was at first curious about my own family, but then curious about God's larger redemptive plan for African Americans in general. And I'm gonna get my answers down quicker because we got a lot to go through. We're trying to do this in an hour, and I like to talk as well as think and read. So, but yeah, it really was, I think, just this quest to know my people and where I came from that led me on this path of history.
Well, you're inspiring a lot of people, specifically young Black women who are Christians with your chapter in the book. But we want to know who has inspired you. So if you had to narrow it down to your favorite historians, who would you say they are and why?
Goodness, my favorite historians. I mean, I have so many influences in terms of inspiration, mainly of men and women of God in the church. But I think in terms of history, it was the work of, I read a book, I think that's also a part of unlocked me. It was like, I want to do this. I don't even know how to do this, but I want to do it. And it was the book, Aren't I a Woman by Deborah Gray White. And it's the first book dedicated to the experiences of enslaved women. And I read that as an undergrad, and it rocked my whole little brain. And so Deborah Gray White actually ended up becoming my doctoral advisor at Rutgers University when I went to graduate school. And so I got to work with her. The works of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who's written Righteous Discontent on Black women in the Baptist Church, was really formative to me in my years as a scholar. Really, a group of Black women historians are who inspire me. The generations of pioneering Black women historians like Darlene Clark Hine and Rosalind Terborg Penn. And I'm honored to be a part of an organization that they began in the 1970s called the Association of Black Women Historians. And so I really see myself as an inheritor of their tradition. And being a Black woman historian is not always an easy thing, but the stories of Black women are too important not to tell.
That's such an amazing answer. Those are some very admirable women. And for you to be part of the society of someone who you admire is just awesome. So I love that. How did you get involved with this project, Urban Apologetics?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm a member of Epiphany Fellowship Church, which has been such a blessing. I've been here in Philadelphia. This week will be 8 years, which is kind of crazy. And I've been a part of Epiphany, literally the first Sunday. There's a whole story of God, how I got there. But, the first Sunday that I moved to Philadelphia, I went to Epiphany Fellowship and never left. And so, I got to know Pastor Mason and have been a part of the frequency conferences, the Thriving Frequency conferences. And I guess they found out I was a historian. Who even knows? Like the origin story, I don't even know about that. But I had been doing a lot of teaching around Black history and the church and Black church history for the frequency conferences over the years that really began to get me thinking about how history is as an apologetic. Because remember, I do not have a seminary degree in history. My history degree is not coming from a Christian institution. I went to Rutgers University, which has the top program in African-American history. And so I was trained as a secular historian. I mean, that's how I was trained. And so, but to be trained in that way, particularly at the very moment where I am being discipled into Christ, right? And so I'm sort of learning about God's vision of history as I'm reading scripture. History is everywhere. If you ever doubt I tell people all the time, like my work, I believe history work is divine work, because look at all the times where God calls us to remember. Look at all the books of the Old and the New Testament that are historical books. Like understanding the history of a people and where we've been and where we go, and not to forget and to pass things down. It is at the heart of our faith and who we are as believers. And so I'm learning that while I'm learning the historical methodology that I'm learning within my graduate program. And so those things become, they start meshing and coming together. I really wanted from the very beginning of getting my degree, I was like, Lord, this is for you. Because honestly, when I first became a believer, my first semester in graduate school, I was ready to quit graduate school. And because it was such the Lord just snatched me out of darkness. And I was like, it's over. Like, take it all, Lord, take the degree, take everything. And I remember laying it down, saying, I'm going to go on the mission field. I had all these ideas of what it meant to serve God. And God is like, no, you're going to go back and finish that degree. And that's going to be your mission field.
Wow.
The secular university, the knowledge and all that stuff, all that's for him. So yeah, I don't even remember the question. I'm sorry, rambling on. I hope I answered your question. I'm sure I'll come back to it in some way. I answered something, but yeah, it just, to me, those two things come together. Both I was being trained as a historian and coming into faith, and those things collided. And yeah, so when I've done the things at church, when Pastor Mason, when the Lord put this on his heart, which was amazing, it was just an honor to be invited to add to the conversation about Black church history. I did remember.
Yeah.
You did a fire job too on that chapter.
I just
gotta
want to say we are so appreciative of your work, because I'm so sick and tired of people saying that Christianity started at the Council of Nicaea. That's where they invented Jesus and all this type of jazz, as if history is not a thing to be studied or attained.
Right.
So I just appreciate the fact that you're invested in making this your mission field, because I'm tired of the pseudo history, sis. I ain't gonna lie to you now.
You tired. I'm tired too. I was like, yes. And just, I think some kind of historical apathy even among believers. I mean, if I'm honest, while this was about sort of thinking about an apologetic, it also was a message to the church and believers, and particularly, younger generations of millennials and Gen Zs, who I think, because the world that they inhabit is so new and fresh or whatever, that sometimes not give homage to the church, or think of the Black church as this, old antiquated thing that, it's fun to play church, but it's not actually fun or important to study the Black church and its doctrine. It really was a call to that as well, to get us say, like, we ain't no smarter than generations that came before us. I tell my students all the time, you may think you're smarter than enslaved people, but I like, why? Because you have an iPhone? Like, because you have access to technology? Like, imagine the both spiritual fortitude as well as the intellectual fortitude that it took to be able to discern the difference between a God that was being preached to you, that was about keeping you subjugated and keeping you oppressed, and being able instead to discern, like, no, that's not God. I can't even read this Bible, but there's someone in our community who can. And when they read the Bible to us, they don't just collapse the entire word of God into slaves obey your masters. There's a richer God in that. I think that is one of the fiercest theological kind of gulfs to overcome, and the intellectual fortitude that it takes to do that. And so I want us to appreciate that heritage that we come from and pay homage to these folks who did things and lived in ways that I think we can learn a lot from.
Yeah, you had made a comment on one of your interviews. You said, this is not, people wearing shirts that said stuff like, this is not my grandmother's civil rights movement. You was like, y'all doing the same thing. And how do you know it's not your grandmother's civil rights movement? I was like, yes, Dr. Gill, say that.
When a student comes into my class wearing that t-shirt, or someone comes to the church wearing a t-shirt, they're like, oh, but I just go on. Because I'm like, to me, it's so insulting. Like, yes, thank God that our ancestors had dreams for us and sacrificed for dreams and living in ways that are unimaginable, right? Like, my grandmother couldn't even have she could have gone to Rutgers, but she couldn't have gone to some of the universities that I teach in now, right? Except if she was cleaning or whatever. So I get that. But to take away and to think that our ancestors didn't have God-driven dreams of their own, and that, we're doing something so brand new. This is not your mama's civil rights movement. I'm an ancestor's wildest dream. You don't really know your civil rights movement if you think what you're doing is so much more radical than that. You're not more engaged in the Black struggle than Fannie Lou Hamer was. I don't care what you say you do, right? Like, you can't stand up to our foremothers who planned boycotts, who were beaten, all because they knew that the God who made them was greater than what white folks were telling them to do. So we need to be humbled by our history, and not think that just because we're now allowed into little fancy colleges and can carry an iPhone and, have our Bible in 6 translations, that we are somehow smarter or better than the people that came before us.
Awesome. I love everything you're saying so far. I want to hear about how God snatched you, to be honest. I know that's going to take us somewhere else, so I'll stick to the course. I think
I'll try to weave it in somewhere.
Too. I'll be all ears. I think that back to the book, I think that one of the amazing features of the book is how cohesive it is. Like everyone who contributed to it wrote their chapters individually and separately, but each part as a whole came together so smoothly. So my question to you is, I assume in writing it that you read and redid and took things out and just edited a whole ton before you submitted the final. I want to know, now that you've read the book as a whole, is there anything that you would change or write differently or maybe add to a future edition?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I love thinking about it because, I mean, it's as much as I enjoyed writing the chapter and going through the revisions and process and all that, what I was, more excited probably than anyone when the book came out and have been able to kind of sit with it and go through it and be a student, right? I mean, there's so much that I've learned in this text. No one should come to this with any kind of error. Just because I wrote my little Black history chapter doesn't mean that I wasn't taken in by thinking about, just the complexities of Black mystery cults and Hebrew Israelitism and even, on Black Muslims, all this stuff. So I came to this as a learner, and I'm always, I'm a teacher because I'm a learner first, right? I teach because something isn't real to me that I learn. I teach because I'm excited about what I learn. That's what I tell people, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I just want to tell you. It's like, if I know something, I want to tell you. And so this book really equipped me. And it got me thinking, if I were to redo this chapter or have an opportunity to do something else, is because the Black church has been encountering a lot of things that we're encountering today, which we think is new, that like people saying Christianity is a white man's religion, or even like the Black Hebrew Israelite religion, all that stuff, ain't none of that new, right? And I always have these conversations with Pastor Mason, and he always laughs because I'm like, when folks are coming back, I was like, this is just like when we were in college in the 90s. Like I remember every man was I, God, this and all that. I was like, oh, they're back. Every about 30 years, the cycle continues. But what I would love to do is to really do the research. And I'm doing this when I'm writing, I'm learning along the way to see how past generations of believers encountered and engaged these false doctrines, encountered and engaged the critique of Christianity as a white man's religion. I mean, that was happening in slave quarters, that critique, like, why are we going to follow their Jesus, right? They're the ones who are oppressing us. And so really digging into the archive and hearing the voices of our ancestors to see, like, how did they deal with this stuff? This isn't new for us. There's a fount of knowledge for us. And God always wants us to go back and remember what he did in previous generations. And so, thinking about that, like, how did they put their apologetic together for their era? And so that's something that this book and reading through it and understanding a bit more about some of these other contexts spurred me on to think about.
Awesome.
So I just want to say, Dr. Gill, the teacher in me, we best friends. I just want you to know. You saying a lot of stuff, and on the inside, my child goes like, yes.
I was her best friend first. I was her best friend first.
You didn't know. But see, you don't got the same connection. The teacher connection.
It's a teacher thing.
I mean, listen. We don't even have to argue with you understand, Dr. Gill. The truth don't need to be argued. That's what my mama used to say. We have to defend the truth. It just presents itself. That's it. That's what you do. So it's so wonderful to hear you talk of having a healthy look back at our ancestors, right? Because we're in this time where it's like, let's pray to the ancestors. What they gonna do?
Right.
How they finna help us?
Right.
It's gone. Okay.
Right.
Them is gone. Let's pray to a living God. How about that?
That's right.
And so I'm excited for that work. I promise you. I really am excited.
Like, don't put out there. Pastor Mason's gonna be like, get on that.
Look, not just Pastor Mason, because we're like, best friend. How you doing? Well, I'll look at best friend.
Yeah, I'm curious. Again, I come to all this out of curiosity first and foremost. And so, like, how do they do it? Right. We don't need to pray to the answers. We praying to the living God, but we can learn from those who came before us. Just as, there's so much in sort of Jewish tradition, which is about sort of repeating things that were said. You think about the Exodus and the repeating of the story. Like, there's something about that remembrance, right? Of reading Torah aloud, all that kind of engagement. That is what we're supposed to get from our past, not praying to folks who can't do anything about it. They lived the life that God called them to live on this earth. Now it's our choice to watch and learn from them, but certainly not go to them for the help that we can only get from God.
Right, exactly. Every time you say remember, I just hear Mufasa. Y'all watch The Lion King? Remember when Simba, he was like, remember, Rafiki came and Mufasa was like, remember. The
Bible, I need to count that word out. That'll be my other project. There's so many variations of the remember that God calls us to do. That I think that we don't remembrance stones and all of that stuff that's within scripture that we need to fully engage.
All right.
And I just want to make a quick note that Dr. Gill do have 2 books out already, Beauty Shop Politics and To Turn the Whole World Over, that y'all can cop while we waiting for her to write our new book that's supposed to be coming out. So
get in line.
For what we getting, let's get the book she already wrote first, and then that way we be ready for the next book. Come on, y'all. We got to make this work.
I'm just saying. I got a lot of work. Come work
exactly.
with me. Y'all are smart. I want y'all to come help me.
We're helping now.
We got you.
So in speaking of just the Black church and our ancestors, the Black church itself, just the name is just to hear the phrase is under attack. Oh, that's CRT and wokeism. I'm like, it's history. It's okay, but anyway. Right. So let's just clear up some stuff right now. What is the Black church? Let's put a definition behind this. What are we considering the Black church when we say that term?
So before I even think about putting a boundary or a definition on it, the church is always a living organism, right? As Jesus's bride, right? So it's not going to be easily definable. But what I always want to say first is, before we even think about the boundaries of the Black church and how it originated and what it means in relationship, is like, the Black church, I think we always have to think first and foremost, and I think I say this in my chapter, is a miracle, right? Is a miraculous redemption story, quite possibly one of the strongest redemption stories that has been written in this part of the world in the last 4 centuries, right? Because the Black church, it emerges. There are 2 ways to think about it. We can think about the Black church, and I talk about it in the chapter, and kind of the institutionalized Black church that emerges when right here in the city of Philadelphia, group of African Americans who were forced to pray at St. George's Church up in the balcony in segregated spaces from their white counterparts. So they were, free Blacks living in the city of Philadelphia who were not welcome to sit in the pews among their white brothers and sisters and congregants, and were segregated. And at one point, they're praying, right? Like, just think about the power of this, right? When we think about how fly we are in our time and how woke we are, right? Are being like snatched up and dragged out the church, right? And so they go on to create their own, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so we can think about origin stories in that way. But I think it's also important to not just think of the Black church as sort of a large entity that it now is, born out of just oppression, but also something born out of love of God and joy, right? So that even when we think about what Albert Rabbitoh calls the invisible church, which existed during enslavement, that wasn't an institutionalized church, right? But was often on larger plantations. There would be church services that were sanctioned by slave masters, and enslaved folks would be required to attend, and they would hear whatever message, which usually was about, obedience and hierarchies and, a real kind of adulteration of what the gospel really is. And then they would, in the evenings, on Sundays, on their days off, pull away and have their own church. Right? And it always was, and this is why education and the Black church are so linked, because it was the person, remember, reading and literacy was outlawed in slavery, right? In most states. So to learn how to read was a defiant act. And part of why it was outlawed, yes, it's about information and knowledge and all of that, but it's outlawed because they didn't want enslaved people to read the word for themselves. Right. Think about that when you're struggling to, you know, read through your Bible, right? That like they literally, that part of that oppression was about, yes, keeping people illiterate and therefore not able to move across, but it was about getting the word for themselves. And so when someone learned to read, the first thing they would go to would be the Bible and then read it. And we have preachers who are preaching the word. Like that was their Black church too. It was their safety, their sanctuary, the place where they could pour out their hearts to God, to the true God, not the God that is being formed in the image of white supremacy to oppress them, but the God that is carrying them through, the God to whom they wedded, right? When you think about this, about slave marriages, and then I'll go, because I can go off on this stuff all day. You know, marriages were illegal in slavery, right? There's no, as an enslaved person, you did not have legal status. And so when we think about marriage, it's a spiritual union, right? For those of us who are believers, but it's also a legal union, right? But then slave marriages were prohibited, but they would still get married because they would get married in the spirit. They couldn't make a legal covenant, but their marriages had meaning and their families had meaning because they made it to God, right? Like, so when we think about the Black church, we have to think about not just it being born of oppression, but also the ways that it functioned to really undergird and give life to and spiritual meaning and spiritual foundation to people who were being preached a false gospel, right? So you think of it, the Black church, I'm gonna go and say this, I just made this up, is an apologetic in and of itself, right? It is apologetic against what some have called the slaveholders' religion, right? The Black church of looking at the totality of the gospel and looking at the gospel and its heavenly implications, looking at it in its totality, looking at its implications for how we live on earth, is in and of itself an apologetic to white supremacy.
Yeah, you brought up the slave narratives, and I've read a couple of those. Mm-hmm. And even reading slave narratives, not one time where there was like, oh, we were Hebrews, or we're originally Muslims, or any of that. They specifically talk about the Christian God, liberating mm-hmm. them even while they were in slavery. So I'm mm-hmm. glad you brought those up.
Yeah, and I also think it's important for us too when we think about the complexity. And I think this is also as an apologetic to folks who claim it being the white man's religion, and that when Black folks got here, they had no choice. There were Black enslaved Muslims, right? There are people who, because remember, Islam had penetrated all throughout Africa and had even gone into West Africa, just like Christianity had. And so it wasn't just like that folks came with this blank slate and then white folks delivered them Christianity. They're like, okay, we'll go with that. I mean, there was that there was a renouncing for many African descendant believers, right? Because they're also coming in from communities and traditions, some of them that practice things that were not Christianity as well. So I think that, instead of saying like, thinking that like, Christians, they just became Christians because they had no other choice. Like, no, they had they just like we all have choices about who we're going to follow, right? And who we're going to give our lives to. They made conscious choices, and there were other prevailing things going around. There was, sort of the traditional African religions. There were Islam was there, all of that. And so the people that chose Christianity chose it in the same way that we were called by faith into choosing it. And so I think that's important too, that understanding the complexity, I think, doesn't make it a harder thing, but it actually kind of refutes that. But yeah, no, I mean, the idea of being Israelites and all that, I mean, it's hard for me, honestly, to engage a lot of the Hebrew Israelite kind of doctrines and the kind of Black mystery cult doctrines, because it's harder for me as a trained historian to have an apologetic against it because it's so ridiculous. Like, it makes no sense. Like, I'm just, like they're not even using real sources to me, like it's hard for me to engage because I'm like, how do you engage with like truth and foolish, like just stuff that just don't make sense?
You could say foolishness. You could say
foolishness, right? Folly, right? But it's important to do so. And that's one area, again, of growth. And me as always wanting to be a learner more than I even want to be a teacher, is that I want to do some of that work and push through the folly in the same way that Paul and other apologists would go through and say, this, you serve this God, but let me tell you about the true living God. Like, we do have to do. And that's what this book has really compelled me, even as one of the contributors, to jump into apologetics more fully because, I'm a leader at the local church. I'm a lover of Jesus, all that. I would never have put the word apologist or apologetics on what I do. And we need to all rethink that. As believers, we all have an apologetic mission because we're always encountering doctrines and ideas that go against God, right? And so we need to all be equipped to be able to do that work.
I just say, because you said that about Hebrew Israelite and Islam, we should do a show with you. We should have you on and let's go at them together.
Like any person coming in for understanding, I need to do my homework first. So before you start unleashing me, I got the Spirit of God with me. So, I know I could go into battle, but we'll see. You'll let me know.
We'll wear head wraps together.
And head wrap is fine. That's the thing. I think we have to engage. It is an attack on the church, and anything that's an attack on the church. And there's so many things, right? Particularly for me, as someone who teaches in a university. I mean, daily I'm having to engage in some kind of apologetic of Christianity, because if you think the Hebrew Israelites go off on Black Christians, you should see what happens in the academic space. So I was like, I ain't scared of Hebrew Israelites, because I've sat in faculty meetings where the name of Christ is demeaned and Christians are talking about a certain way. So I'm like, they better come. I have friends who serve in Muslim nations as missionaries, and we would share stories about attacks for the gospel's sake. And they're like, we actually think you're on a harder mission field on a university. I was like, I think I am. So they better come with it.
Wow. Well, since we're on the topic of the Black church, first off, I wanted to shout out our brother Isaiah Robertson. He was in the chat earlier. He had to step out, but he wrote the book Black Church Empowered. We all loved it. But we wanted to ask you, how important do you think it is for the survival of the Black church?
You mean do I feel like we're at a point of crisis, or? Yeah,
because like we were just talking about, we take a lot of hits. You're taking it in the academic field. The Hebrew Israelites are coming for us. The woke conscious folk are coming for us. So
not to mention the white, evangelical.
Yeah. We should not see color. We should not. It's one church. Nobody's saying
Marxists. All y'all Marxists.
Yeah, we're Marxists, and just by us sharing a picture of you talking about this interview tonight, all of a sudden, with the book on there, all of a sudden we were woke. This woke CRT Marxist stuff is a sin, and I'm like, how does Black people having their dignity restored with the gospel evoke this response? I'm not sure.
Now, those are the folks I'll take in a minute, because I'm like, capitalism is sin too. It's actually more sin than Marxism and socialism. Anyway, we do they really want to jump in there? I mean,
now let's do a video about that. We can talk about the 10 pillars of Marxism, the 10 pillars of Marxism and capitalism, and how they compare.
The thing that frustrates me, now y'all got me all. Let me calm down. But what is so frustrating to me about these hurling of accusations is that critical race theory is a real thing. That none of them could even name one critical race theorist, could tell me what it is, right? Instead, these terms become emptied and weaponized to just anything you say about Black people having any kind of humanity and dignity in the eyes of God, right? Because none of them are talking about critical race theory. None of them know what it is. None of our pastors never even know what critical race theory is. Like, they don't even, like, they're not teaching this, because they're like, I didn't even know that was until white folks started accusing me of it. I did study, I'm not an expert in critical race theory, but I know what it is. It's a specific legal tract and doctrine that emerges in the 80s and 90s. Like, there's a whole specific thing that none of this engages with, right? And even the attacks on things like, I'm not a Marxist. I don't claim to be it. I'm not saying it's a perfect thing, whatever, but I'm like, have you looked at capitalism lately in terms of thinking about the gospel, right? I mean, this, y'all might get thrown off the air. They really gonna come for y'all now, because now, like, she's talking about capitalism. But like, don't worry about capitalism is not a godly doctrine. Actually, the only time we see it appearing in biblical context is usually a bad thing. But like, capitalism is based on valuing human beings differently. That there are people who will do well and there are people who won't. I mean, this entire COVID crisis has shown us that some people are considered expendable within a capitalist system because of the jobs they do. So like, I don't see how that connects with Christianity and the belief that we're all made in the imago Dei, when literally under capitalism, all of our lives are valued differently. So we can have a conversation about the ills of Marxism. I can jump in on them too, but only if we give the same kind of critical eye toward the systems that we embrace of nationalism and patriotism and capitalism, because them ain't godly either.
Exactly. Okay. And the problem becomes when you're trying to tie the gospel and Christianity to these systems.
Right.
We're not supposed to do that.
Right. Listen, they're flawed.
Jesus is king. Period. Jesus
Period.
is king. Period. So I don't need to tie my witness and the church's witness or the gospel to capitalism, Marxism, socialism. None of that. I don't need to tie to any of that. We're not supposed to.
What we're supposed to be living. You know what I'm saying? They're all have sins and flaws. And as believers, yeah, we have to be in the world and not of it, right? Like we all have to participate in capitalism because, you know, that's how we eat and function.
Exactly.
But to say that that is like the divine, godly route is such an insult to God. I mean, the way that capitalism literally feeds off inequality is completely antithetical to everything I've read in the gospel about Jesus. So let's have that conversation. You know, let's have that critique. How do we as believers, and I think this is important, right? All of us are struggling with this of being in the world, not of it, of how do we live in corrupt world systems, even though we're our kingdom and our king and our leader and our ruler is from somewhere else. Like, you know, we're aliens in this land. We're ambassadors. Like the Bible tells us that. That's not a surprise. So to think that we're living in that the United States and capitalism and American democracy is, you know, some kind of biblical, you know, kingdom is completely a lie.
Well, that's because a lot of people don't know what an actual theocracy would look like in real life. Right. So they want to make capitalism some form of theocracy. And in reality, they don't know what actual capitalism is, because in its perfect form, if you fail, you fail. Nobody's bailing you out. And we bail out a lot of people in our capitalistic society that we shouldn't, because we're not practicing pure capitalism either.
I mean, the thing about it's all about power, right? Jesus warned us about that. That all of this, the same reason why the religious leaders were part of crucifying Christ, right? Is because he didn't come to set them up in power the way they wanted. People are sort of holding on to nationalism and capitalism, all that stuff, because they're the ones benefiting from it in power. So to critique it would mean to give their power up. And that's the issue. That's completely it, right? If Marxism worked out for them, they'd be Marxist. You know what I mean? Like, and so I think that that's something that we should not only think about pointing it to others, but need to point that to ourselves. Where are the areas in our own lives, even as Black women, right, who certainly are on the sides of oppression in many ways, but they're privileges that we have and inhabit. And if we allow our sense of privilege to override God's mandate for how we should live in that area, then we're doing the same thing. And so I always like to say, as much as I can go off and critique these folks, and they need to be critiqued, pointing to myself, right? What am I doing with my educational privilege, right? Is it good enough that I got my degrees and I'm doing all right? Or what do I think about people in my community that are in need? That's what I think the message of Black church women has been. And that's why I put those examples in the chapter of the women at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, who, like, you know, they were some of the first Black women social workers. And yes, they had their professional jobs, but they brought that to their churches, but always with the goal of saving souls. And that what was most exciting to them is when they could say, yeah, these young women that we brought in for this program, now they're following Jesus, right? So we have to think about, what is it that we have learned? What is it that we have been blessed with? What is it that we can function in power? And do we hoard it? Do we do it to keep ourselves maintaining power? Or are we, like Jesus, emptying ourselves to do true gospel work? I think that's a question that I would pose to those critiquing critical race theory and all that stuff, and I'd pose it to ourselves.
So you're saying the gospel has feet? That's what I'm hearing you say. The gospel gives you something.
Jesus said that in many ways. Right? We literally saw the gospel having feet when Jesus came on earth and worked among us. So yeah, he is the word.
Amen.
The gospel, and he had feet, and he was here, and he said, he walked among us. So yeah, the gospel definitely has feet.
So I think this next question you about to go off. So I'm gonna just sit back.
I mean, it doesn't take much. I mean,
when they ask you this one, I'm just sit back and I'm gonna just let you go. I'm gonna hit the go button. It just go.
So we were talking about the Black church. We were talking about critique. How would you respond to someone saying the Black church? Now listen to what I'm asking. The Black church owes reparations to African Americans for aiding in the loss of African culture.
First of all, I mean, I know there's a whole kind of movement, which I didn't know about. Again, I sometimes from my perch in the academy, I miss some of these nitty gritty kind of arguments. That's ridiculous. Because the culture of retentions, and there's a lot of scholarship and work on the culture of retentions that African American people to this day we still have in terms of African connections. But yes, a lot was lost and stripped. And the culprit of that is not the Black church. The culprit of that was this capitalistic slavery system that turned us, right, from different people, from different tribal groups, and threw us together to amalgamate us to be their unpaid labor force. And therefore, we were not able to stay connected to our specific kind of tribal identities, the people who took away our personhood and even our ability to name and to share historical documents, took away literacy from us, so we could not sort of leave a written record for generations. That's what owes us any kind of reparations for the loss of our Africanism. In fact, the Black church is what has helped us to maintain some of that connection. And furthermore, I said I wasn't gonna go off. I'm gonna go. Furthermore,
go off. Let him give him all the smoke.
I haven't
just let it go. Feel it in your shadow and let it out.
So I usually get this out with my students. You can imagine, they think I'm quite animated. But the other part too, like, have you seen how the Black church has contributed financially, politically, economically, educationally to every Black achievement we have ever had? Like, most HBCUs have church connections and church funding that our social movements toward justice and freedom and voting rights and all of that stuff were all connected to church. So if you're gonna start saying that, like, let's run the numbers then. And I don't even think we could even foretell the impact that local churches and Black church denominations have had on local communities and in far-reaching ways. So to me, that is folly.
Amen.
Amen. Well,
You heard it here.
Say amen.
The doctor has spoken. Okay.
I'm out of control.
And historian, and also historian. Let's not forget the historian part.
It's not a real degree. Okay, no. She that made and printed on the internet.
I know, by God's grace. Man, I got received. No, that's one thing.
No, she said,
the Lord, I got received.
Dr. Gill said, "Let's run the numbers." That's
run the numbers. Run it up. But we got a mic drop in the comments.
I'm gonna behave from now on, I promise.
Okay, Dr. Gill. So after that mic drop, we'll pick back the mic up and you can answer this. So your chapter, Black Church History and Urban Apologetics. Can you talk here about how important history is in the life of the believer and the Christian apologist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit before, so I'll be brief, but mainly, and I use the example, I wrote this chapter, and I think it's so important that, for folks who haven't read the book, like, if you haven't got Urban Apologetics yet, like, what you waiting for? But if you haven't read through it yet, it's not just like, these things happen in Black church history, or I'm just kind of there it is, I got mine right here too. I'm just dropping stuff around, whatever. Is that the way the Lord brought me to this was through Psalm 73. And just this whole, you look through that Psalm and it's all about history and remembering, right? And literally we are commanded to know history. right? Commanded to know it. It says, my people hear my instructions, listen to the words from my mouth. I will declare wise saying, I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known that our ancestors have passed down to us, but will teach a future generation. And it keeps telling us that, that it is actually sin to not pass down the stories of previous generations of what God has done. Like, that's enough. Like I was like, it's in the book. Like all the kind of drawing and commanding and, the times when God gets angry at his people about not, because you didn't remember, you didn't forget, like that's enough, I think, for all of us. And I know, look, I always encounter two kinds of people when people find out I'm a history professor. People were like, oh, I loved history, or oh, I hated history. And I blame your teachers, because it's all about a teacher. Because if you had a teacher that brought history to life as stories, which is all history is, right? Everybody loves stories. Then you would have been fine. So but you had a teacher who taught you history as sort of these facts that you had to remember, you wouldn't. And so God is trying to get us back into the art of storytelling. And not just any old random stories, but stories of God's faithfulness, declaring them, what he's done, not just in our lives, but what he's done in our church communities. One of the things I call for in the chapter is an old school Black tradition. Like, we get a little brand new in our new kind of new Black churches. I have this whole thing about the Black church and new Black church, but I'm not gonna go into it here. But that we get all brand new and new Black, where like, I'm like, where are our church historians? Right? Back in old school day, there was always usually an older woman who was a church historian, who was the fount of knowledge about the church, who kept every bulletin, who remembered that time when they weren't going to make the mortgage and that God prayed them through. Like, we need to have that back in our churches. We need to think about not just, sort of remembering like the number of people, remembering figures and money and all those kinds of records. But think about just the local church. I think about Epiphany Fellowship, and I guess it was for the 12th anniversary or 13th, I can't remember, a couple of years ago. We did a little mini documentary kind of tracing the history of the church. And it was, and I was involved in it, whatever. And it was just so amazing to go back and see God's faithfulness just to this one local body of believers, right? That's important. I think that when we're not doing that, we're missing a lot. And where there are things that mistakes we're making that we could not make. I also think, particularly for new Black churches or church planting churches, to go into communities and to not understand and appreciate, or neighborhoods, the rich historical legacy and tradition of believers that were already there before many of us were even born, whose knees are rough from the prayers that they have been praying over these communities and all that. Like, honor those people, talk to those people, get their stories. Like, I would love it. Think about just the impact of this in terms of ministry, and also in terms of the mandate to remember. If we went out as believers and communities, you could do this with youth or whatever, and took the oral histories of Black elders in our churches and in our communities, to have them talking about God's faithfulness and recording those. And, just think about the impact it would have on the young people that are doing it, on the older people in the community as a form of ministry, right? And it's so easy. We can do that easily, right? But also, it's not just a fun activity. It is a faith gospel strengthening activity to hear about people who have gone ahead and have had to pray in things and watch God move, right? And so I think those are all the things that we should really do when we think about why history should be important to us as believers, and how it should be used as a part of our ministry and apologetics.
That's awesome. And this next question, I actually think you already touched on a lot as well. Where would someone start their journey into studying the history of the Black church?
Yeah, I mean, oh goodness, I'm always ready to give people a whole bibliography, but I think, there's some kind of canonical texts. I think the work of Albert Rabbitoe on the Invisible Institution. I think he does some of the best work on the enslaved church. reading those books. C. Eric Lincoln's classic work, Carter G. Woodson, right? The father of Black history, we think about that. Much of his early work was about the Black church, and he wasn't even really a believer. He had a respect, and that's the thing. Like, you look at even folks like Du Bois and some of those who, I don't historically did not, sort of proclaim Christ publicly in many ways. Some people will argue with that, but we can leave it for another day. But they had an honor and reverence for the Black church in ways that we as believers often don't, right? Like, and so we need to think about that. So I think reading those texts, and then I also think, like I said, to me, where you should start is in the community in which you live and serve, and start learning the history there and the church history there, right where you are. Learn your own church history. I tell folks all the time, like, most, if people are in cities, there are always universities around cities, right? Everybody knows there's colleges, whatever. Like, use those resources. Connect with people on campuses. Find out about the lectures going on campus, the events going on, the speakers that come on. Many times those are open, right? And so you can start building resources, even if these are not people who are believers and honor God. You can start, learning some things from there and begin putting it together with the information of people who are from faith backgrounds, and beginning to learn. So I think start where you are, start locally, and really dig into the local resources and let that develop a hunger in you. That's the thing, in the era of the Google, even though everything out there is not good information, but in the era of the Google machine, like, there's no excuse to not be able to find something. So I think start locally and where you are. Start with your own church. Do we know the history of our own churches where we are right now? I think start there.
You're about to have me going to all these college campuses, just sitting in lectures for free. Did you say $3.99? $3.99. I will be there.
I'm hoping in the post-COVID, in the after times, like, things will open back up again. Well, actually, no, this year was actually a really good year to engage, because so many things were virtual. So you could, listen to and see things. And I think that practice, even once campuses begin opening, that a lot more, because of budget and convenience, that a lot more lectures and things like that. So find, the universities in your area and find their history departments or their African-American studies departments, and just get on their listserv. Now, there are going to be a lot of things in there that are crazy, but I think you should engage those too. Because one thing that frustrates me as a believer is that being on a college campus gives you a prophetic vision for where culture is headed. Because the people that are here now, right, are going to be the people out in the world changing things in the world. So lots of things that have taken the church by shock in the last couple of years, around all kinds of stuff. I literally have sat in meetings with people and told them this stuff was coming, and believers have laughed at me and I was like, you guys, you don't understand. I'm on a college campus. I see what the conversations are. It's coming. Well, I love that about church anniversaries. Yes. So even like some of the stuff's going to be wild, but that's why we need to strengthen ourselves in knowledge of our doctrine and in apologetics, so that we can rightly discern what is foolishness and what isn't. But don't you dare cover your eyes and be like, ooh, I don't know about that. And understand what's happening, because if you want to know where culture is headed, go to a college campus. And I'm going to tell you, some wildness is it's a front row seat to it. Engage, you can literally just get on their listserv, find the admin in the department, email them, go on their websites and see what events are there and take advantage of them, because they're most of the time are free.
I'm definitely going to start doing that. I don't know about y'all, but that sounds like a good idea to me. But
I selfishly just want believers around, when I'm on campus. I always feel like, just come. I just have people circling buildings where I work, just pray. They were like, ooh, so, like, listen, it's real out here on these university campus streets. So I'm just like, send the people. We can't disengage. I love us going to seminaries and all that. And I like, if I had, an unlimited amount of resources, I would go back to seminary. I would go to seminary. I just keep wanting to go get degrees. I got to actually pay bills. So, but I would do that. But I also want to make sure that more believers are jumping into the academic space and bring it, like, we have the knowledge of the mind of Christ, which is rock the academy. So I'm just trying to get anybody out there who wants to talk, and I talk with folks about this all the time, interested about academic careers, getting PhDs, all that stuff, it would be my honor to talk with you, because we need more soldiers out here for Christ. We really do.
Amen. You're not gonna convict me, but this PhD, Dr. Gill.
I'm just saying, you know, we're laying
today.
Let the Lord use you. I mean, the Lord's just you. I'm just saying, wherever the lands, I just felt led to say that. I'm not saying nothing else. But yeah, we need more. Trust me, because that's where culture is shaped. I always say this when, I talk with folks and when I thought, when I first became a believer in grad school, and I knew I was called to ministry, right? But I thought that meant full time. Although I do consider myself in bivocational ministry. And I actually think that as believers, we should always be thinking of that, right? Like that we, I have ministries in the local church, whatever, but like we're always doing ministry. So I think of it all as ministry. I don't separate, and God doesn't separate, more importantly, the sacred and the secular. And so we have to think of that way. But I thought that ministry in a church was it. And the Lord has just made it very clear to me that the kind of influence that I have, and it's humbling. Like it's something I'm going to account for before the Lord. It breaks me up, because it's like, being called to this place where there are so few believers and standing for Jesus in these spaces is it's incredibly difficult and lonely, but it's an honor. And I think those of us who are called in these areas really need to think of it as ministry as well.
Oh, that's good.
Amen.
Have I just talked the whole time and y'all even got questions? I mean,
no. Okay, so I'll say this. So we're coming up on an hour. If you're okay with about, maybe 20, 30 more minutes, if you're okay with that.
I started, I've been expecting, I was all, crazy.
It's so good. We just feel like talk, sis, because it's so good.
It is.
For the Lord, yeah. I mean, if it's useful, if it's useful and it's useful to the body and for folks, then yes, I mean, Lord, but all the Lord has given me, I can certainly give another 20. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Because we only have a few more questions, but this is so good. Right. So good.
Hold on, Ty, before you go. So I just want everybody to get this in their shanda, okay? Because we talked about this in other places in the Bodega. You heard Dr. Gill say it's something else besides the fivefold. I know some fivefold people listening, okay? Take your butt outside the fivefold. Go to school. Go to somebody's school. She said it. She said what she said, and I concur. Okay, go ahead, Ty. I'm sorry.
No, you good, sis. That was a public service announcement from Dana. I hope you all take heed. All right, so my question is, when you look at the entirety of Black church history, is there a specific time period that you think today's Black church should mimic more?
Yeah, I wouldn't say mimic, because I think that, while there's nothing new under the sun, right, as Scripture reminds us, we are called to different times and different seasons, and the context of things are different. And so I think instead of thinking of like what specific time to mimic, I think it's really just sort of looking at different Black church eras. And the way I divided my chapter, I think I look at the era of enslavement, Reconstruction. I think Reconstruction is probably the era that is often overlooked the most, that period right after the end of slavery. But I think it's the one that's perhaps most instructive, because here we see African Americans sort of, for the first time, really being able to construct their kind of world in ways that they weren't able to. Now, certainly, I'm not saying they had complete freedom. Reconstruction and what happens after certainly is compromising, but there was such an emphasis on Black institution building in that period. And for African Americans, that was churches and schools, which were often the same place. So when they would say, go out to school, I'm like, actually, if we think about in terms of the Black church tradition, church was school and school was church. Those buildings were often the same space. The same activities happened there because folks were raising money after slavery with their very small, and this is the thing too, when you think about giving and generosity, that's something we could be mimicking, because there really isn't an era in the Black church that was not marked by Black generosity, because everything Black folks had, they had to produce themselves. And these folks had a lot less resources than we do, right? They built churches. They built schools that are enduring to this day. When I think about all that our generations have inherited, and we look at the giving, and I have friends who work on Black philanthropy, that African Americans we give less percentage-wise of our income. Now, we're not talking tithes on that, like generosity, which is beyond the tithe, right? Beyond like generosity is at the heart of our faith, but also the heart of our Black church tradition. So if we're gonna mimic something, let's start thinking about that. Institution building, giving, sowing into our communities, into our churches to build it up, supporting ministries. That has been what's marked. There would be no Black church without that. There would be no us without that generosity. Many of us, even, thinking down to like when kids went to college, there was always like a scholarship fund or something. I mean, there was just always that investment. And so I would say the Reconstruction era, I think, has lots of lessons because of that thrust toward institution building.
Awesome.
I think you pretty much answered our next question too. Was saying the Reconstruction is the neglected part of history.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there was a recent, and I think just in sort of the public imagination, when really it's the era that explains everything about today. Like as I was watching, the last 4 years really, but even like the insurrection and just all of that. I mean, down to when I teach my students and I'll show them things from the 1870s where we have white Southern leaders yelling, "We want our country back." I mean, it's literally like handbook. I mean, it's literally like the same language and fervor and all of that around nationalism. It's all there. And so Reconstruction is just this really interesting pivot point where the nation, things could have gone another way if people's sinful hearts had made different choices to really acknowledge Black freedom, quite honestly. And so we have been continuing that long freedom battle since that period. So yeah, I just think that's an era. If you want to dig into an era of history, dig in there. Start with Du Bois's Reconstruction in America, classic text. I don't think anybody, and I have lots of historian friends and people who write on Reconstruction, ain't nobody done it better than him. So start with W.B. Du Bois's Reconstruction in America, and then begin to really look at Black church history in the Reconstruction era.
That's excellent. That's awesome. So we're going to shift it a little bit into something just as probably controversial.
Give me on a controversy, and I just
talking about. Well, this one isn't as much controversial, but it's going to lead into a little bit more of some recent controversy. So oftentimes when we talk about the Black church and Black church history, it's very, the conversation is dominated by,
sorry, my phone is ringing.
Are you fine? Okay. The conversation is dominated by the men who have played such an intricate role in the history of the Black church. So I want you to kind of talk about the role that Black women played in the founding, in the life of this organism called the Black church.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this really even connects to the conversation we're having around generosity, that if we look at sort of just financially, right? And I'll move to the spiritual part, which is more important, but the financial foundations of the church are from Black women, right? And their organizing and their raising of money and all of that. But I think even more spiritually, right? And one of the things I try to do by, bringing in lots of examples of Black women activism in the church is to not just relegate it like, the mothers of the church, had some bake sales and did that, but to really think about the theological contributions that women made. So I think of women like Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was at the beginning of the 20th century, very active in the National Black Baptist Church movement, who started schools for Black women who were migrating from the South into the North. And, the tenet of her school was Bible, bath, and broom. And so, she made sure, and these were women who were coming in need of jobs. So that's where, so she would teach them about domestic work and training, but had a rigorous biblical curriculum, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think about her and looking at her work and so many others, but I think about the Sunday school teachers, right? Who, we think, oh, they're Sunday school. No, these women were imparting doctrine and knowledge into young people that would bear fruit later on. I would love to see, you keep talking about studies, I would love to see some studies of, kind of the curriculum that Black church women have created, right? And to study it for the theology and all that. I think so many times we're so dismissive of them as just doing little things, whatever. But they, the people who would go on and leave their classrooms would go on to pastor, go on to lead movements. Where did they get that foundation from, right? And so I think that we need to not overlook the contributions that Black women have made to the church, not just in the areas of fundraising, but to really think about their contributions to the body and the theology of it, right? In the music and the writing of music and the way they're teaching doctrine through that, the way that they're talking about school. Like, let's respect that, not just as women's busy work, but as contributing to the doctrinal foundations of the Black church.
That's good.
Did I get through all of them?
Yeah. All right. So now we've been talking about, we've gone through like a little ride with the Black church, and we're in an interesting, I think, season in the Black church. So what are some things that you find both concerning and encouraging about the Black church as it functions, exists today?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think one of the things that is concerning is the separation of activism away from the Black church. And even though, there's all these accusations of woke and all this, but this idea that I think for the first time in the 21st century, we're seeing and we're in, and I talk to my students about this all the time, we are in the midst of a social movement, or certainly the past year. Even as someone who's a historian and studies civil rights movements and all that, like what happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd was a veritable social movement. Now we're sort of reflecting back and be like, well, what has actually changed or happened? But it was probably the widest range of social movements of people hitting the street, marching, et cetera. What's concerning to me is that the Black church is not at the forefront of this. And in fact is marginalized from it, pushed by, I think, for a host of reasons, a host of complex reasons. And I think that that's dangerous. Because while absolutely justice and all these issues they're biblical issues, but to have justice, and Pastor Mason preaches so eloquently about this, justice without righteousness is a problem. And so in our battles for justice for African Americans and Black folks and brown folks, we always want to keep it wedded to the righteousness of God, right? Because otherwise it is just justice in our own human machinations, which is always limited, always going to be problematic. And so that concerns me. And this is the first time, I think, where we're really seeing that, where, the Black church was at the forefront of abolition, forefront of kind of the Black, HBCU movement, forefront of the civil rights eras, et cetera. So divorcing that concerns me. But there is hope. I mean, I think just even this gathering tonight gives me great hope of folks, particularly Black women, who are hungry for God and are not satisfied with a watered down version, but are rightly dividing the word of truth and providing forums and opportunities for people to talk about real things. And so I'm really encouraged by that, and just want to see where God takes that. So yeah.
Okay, so piggybacking off that excitement, in light of recent conversations regarding the role of women in the church, what has your experience, you mentioned that you're a leader, what has your experience been as a leader in your local church?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really blessed, and I don't take this lightly. I've been in circumstances and situations where this was not the case, and I know of people with cases that are not, but I have just, I feel at Epiphany Fellowship that I had, and I'm not just saying this is like, because Pastor Mason's the editor of the book, like if y'all haven't learned anything about me, is that I'm direct and wouldn't know how to fake it if I tried, but I feel so free in ministry in some ways. There are challenges of being a woman in ministry, and we can talk about those too, but there's a freedom where I feel as a woman that I'm valued, even before I do anything, but that I'm valued before God, but also valued at my church. Particularly being a single woman, an older single woman, there's often people don't know what to do with us. And I think there's a whole conversation about they just don't. But like I said, I've been there 8 years and just have been embraced by the community. But also, and I think this is part of it too, is like, showing up and just being willing to serve however you can. Like that's what I came to do. I've served in leadership in other church capacities, but these folks at Epiphany didn't know me when I came here, and I just wanted to show up and showed up at things to serve. And the Lord makes room for your gifts, but it's been a blessing to be at a church where women are valued, not just in our traditionally feminine roles we think of as mothering and all of that, but are valued as thinkers, are valued as theologians, are valued as people who know the word and study the word. And then just my experience with women's ministry, Dr. Sarita Lyons is the leader of Salt Women's Ministry. So, we're not in there, just putting flowers together. Although we like that because we're very girly too. We have all different kind of folks, I like pretty things and decorating, and we have fun and we do all that. But like, we go hard on God. We go hard into the word. We go deep in that. Because that's the thing. I'm like, it's not like there's a boy devil and a girl devil, right? Like, I don't know about y'all, but the enemy comes hard after me. So I need to know how to be strong in that, right? I need to know the word for myself. It's not something for the boys. Right. It's something that we as women need to go after because we are equal in value in God's sight. He has made us differently, and that's beautiful and something to be celebrated, but certainly not lesser than. And so it's beautiful to be at a church where that happens. But I do think that it is challenging sometimes as a woman in leadership and earning respect, not just from men, but sometimes from women themselves, right? That because of the ways that we have often been kind of dismissed or et cetera, that sometimes it's easier to take it out on another woman than to take it out on a man. And so I think as women in leadership, we often get that. So I think, I'm learning and growing. That's what I love. I love being in a space where I'm free to be me, but I'm free to learn and have pastors who take the time to make sure that we're being built up in the word. So just go hard after God, women. Like, Jesus sacrificed the blood he shed and went to the cross. It was for us too. Like, it wasn't like there's like the men get the good, redemption and we get the side of that. Like, absolutely not. And so we need to be in spaces and have our gifts nurtured, right? The gifts are not gendered, right? It doesn't say, okay, these are the boy gifts and these are the girl gifts, right? That, men are gifted in these areas, women are gifted as teachers, women are gifted in so many ways. Even if our roles, we have these functions. And so I just want to encourage women in the church, in the workplace, in the home, everywhere God sends us to just show off his glory. So it's nice being in a church that values that.
And with all that, you kind of just answered the other question I was going to ask, or at least part of it. So I wanted to ask you what encouraging words you might have for women who wanted to get more into apologetics, but also women who might be interested in history or becoming a historian.
Mm-hmm. Pray. It sounds really kind of cop-out-ish, but pray in the sense of like, sit at the feet of Jesus and see what he has for you or how he's leading you. Because I think that takes away our comparison. I think that there's a lot of issues that, like, I would hate for any young woman to be out there looking like, oh, wow, like, in order to make a difference, I got to go be a historian, whatever. Like, that's not the point. That's the road that the Lord has called me to. And most times I'm grateful about that, but some days it's hard. But, that's the road. And so I think just deepening in our relationships with God and understanding and hearing from him, his heartbeat for us, and walking, even when we don't even see the end of the destination, just following after where he's calling us to do. Because no matter where he calls you, particularly if he's calling you into any kind of leadership thing, but you know, in any area, there's going to be attack, there's going to be frustration, there's going to be warfare, all of that stuff is going to happen. And so there have been so many times I have given up on this profession. I mean, I could write a whole story of the many times I quit grad school. Most times in my head, one time I actually did it. And you know, and just several, but what kept coming back was that I knew that God called me to this, and I was going to persevere. If only there were moments where I only persevered just out of obedience to God, because I was done. While I was on the 10-year track, same thing. Like I've been teaching now 18 years in the fall. I'm getting old. You know, I was young. You know, professor. All this, so much attack. So, you know, the main thing is to know your God, and to one thing that I'm working through this summer, I've sort of dedicated the summer to this, is learning what it means to be God's beloved. Because I truly feel, and this is, you know, for myself, I might break down on this. It's like, if I truly understood that, what God's love is, and the sacrifice he made to make it possible for me to be his child, it would change everything about my life. There's not an area of life that just understanding that simple yet profound and radical truth would not change my life. And so that's where I think that's the call. Our first call is to him, not to anything. Our first call, the first call we answer is to him. And yes, that's salvation, all that, but we have to continue that call, like run to him first, and he will begin to speak things to your heart and, you know, show you where to get counsel, all that stuff. But go to him, get in his arms, understand who he is, what he's done, and how he loves you. And then you start on that journey in that road. So that would be my advice.
Well, amen. Thank you. And thank you for really sharing your heart with us, for history, for facts, and just living history, and just your passion. I told you, we best friends. I just want you to know. I know they said that earlier, but I just had to reiterate, because they'll try to insert themselves in our friendship, Dr. Gill, okay? But with that being said, what are some practical ways Christians can embody a robust apologetics, particularly in the urban context?
I think awareness, right? And I think this ear on the ground thing, like what I was saying, like know what's out there, because particularly in our kind of rapidly changing generations, that like waves and things, like even I think Pastor Mason was talking about this in a sermon one time, like even our notion of what a generation has shrunk, because things move at such a quick pace. And so the first thing we have to know as an apologist, and I think Paul lays this out, is like knowing what the word is on the street. Like, what are people putting their hopes in? What are the idols right now, right? Like knowing, and it's a hard thing. And that's why you have to be built up in faith first, because you can start, you know, looking at them idols, and then if you're not secure in your faith, you get pulled into them, right? So that's not it. So knowing what that is. And then I also think for an apologist, and this may seem practical or not, you can think about it, but is to be pure before the Lord, like the purity of faith and doctrine. We got to know what we know. We got to know who our God is. We got to know what our God says about things, because folks out in the world, they know their stuff. They know what's going on, and they will eat us alive as believers if we don't know. And so really, like, I think that if there are aspects of the faith that are unclear to you, even though you're a believer and you love the Lord and all that, but like the Trinity, I need to be clear on that. Or like sanctification, like, okay, I know I've heard it and I kind of know it. Dig deep and study that stuff out. Like take, 2-3 months to just really dig that. Like literally, I'm spending 3 months this summer learning about the love of God, right? Like I've been a believer for 20 something years. I know the love of God, but I'm going to dig into that. Because if someone comes at me and says, if God is so loving, why did these children die? Or if God is so loving, why did this person suffer? Whatever. I need to know that for myself as a believer before I can ever start engaging in any kind of conversation with you as an apologist. So know your God and like dedicate, like really go through like the doctrines of God and see if there any that confuse you or that you're like, what's that? What's soteriology? Like, you know, and again, it's not about the terms, but it's about the doctrine. So I would say, and I'm giving, you know, I'm a professor, so I give homework. So, you know, you're a teacher too, you made me give some homework. You know, dedicate the summer to really digging into a doctrine about God that is unclear to you or something that you want to dig deeper in. And that's not saying other stuff that God is leading you to do, whatever, but dig deep in that and see what comes of that, because that's what you'll need as an apologist, is knowing who God is, because people are going to try to tear that down. So that's the homework assignment.
I like it. I'm a homework giver, so we have a
good.
We have a book club for women, and we're going through the book. And
I
so
know, I've seen that.
we've created questions and homework. All the questions are homework,
right?
But we have an extra homework question to do
extra nerds.
For example, with your chapter, we had people, hey, go research some more Black women.
Nice.
Who have made some, who have made contributions to the Black church, whether it's in America or the world over.
Yes.
We also had stuff like, okay, let's talk about HBCUs. How many HBCUs were actually, established from a church? Which ones were they? So this is type of stuff that we're doing. So we're all for homework.
Excellent.
Over here. So with that said, so we kind of circle back to the book a little bit. What is your vision or your hopes for the Urban Apologetics community and the Urban Apologetics book in general?
Yeah, I mean, this book, being a part of it, I knew it was something big, but it really wasn't until it came out that I was like, wow, like there's nothing on the market like this. And, I'm like, because one thing, when I talk to friends who've gone to seminaries, and I ask them like, well, what do you learn about like Black church history or something, just curious, right? And they're like, nothing. And I was like, say what? Like, like how can you be an apologetic in a church history class and not learn anything about any of this stuff, right? And I think that's what's so important about this book in general, not just my chapter, but that, that much of what people learn about apologetics is coming from spaces and not addressing the actual issues and encounters that we face in our urban communities, right? Like, the issues that are coming up in books and classes around apologetics, like, yes, they can help us strengthen the faith, but it's like, right, like, what do you do when the guy's on the corner screaming about, you coming out of church, talking about you part of that white man's religion? There's nothing there to equip this. This is an equipping book. This is a textbook. My dear friend and sister, Dr. Sarita, always talks about like, this is a book you want to give to college students on their way to college. And as a person, I could not agree more. Like giving this to folks to equip them for the context in which we live. And so that's what I would love to see. I would love to see, and again, it's important not just for us as Black believers in this country and elsewhere, but for the church. If we are truly the church, then we need to be aware of what is impacting and tearing down the church from all different sides. And so I want to see this book in seminaries. I want to see more books come out of this book. To me, this is a wonderful conversation starter. And so I want to see people dig deeper into specific issues, go deeper into the Black church, go deeper into the issues of gender, go deeper into the issues around Black Muslims, go deeper into the whitewashing, Pastor Jerome's books coming out. Like, I love just seeing this being part of a much larger conversation. To me, and I'm sure it's not Pastor Mason's heart that like this becomes the definitive work and no one else, like this is part of a movement. That's what I would really like to see this happen, and spurring into other kind of conversations and other kinds of equipping. So to me, the teacher in me is about folks reading this book and feeling equipped in ways that perhaps mainstream seminaries just has not equipped people.
That's good.
That's awesome. Pastor Jerome Gay's book go for pre-order is Friday. Is it, I believe, the 28th or the 29th.
Mhm.
So be on the lookout for that pre-order link, The Whitewashing of Christianity. He wrote chapter 2, All White Everything. So it's like an expanded version
Mhm.
of that chapter. And his book is amazing. So
I feel like
pre-order it.
all these chapters could be books. I mean, like they real like
They can be.
all the chapters left me wanting more.
Me
So,
too.
but like you're like, yes, and that to me is what, you know, is a good thing. Like, yes, there's more. And like we need more voices in this conversation.
Yeah, so I'd be expecting Dr. Tiffany Gill's book coming up. Again, she
Get in
has 2
line.
books out. Buy
I've got a
those
couple of
first.
books people are waiting for right now. Get in line.
Yeah. She has 2 books out already. Buy those books and maybe we can get her to agree to write another one. So and also I've done 2 years of my MDiv and I can tell you we read not one Black scholar at all. Like not one.
Wow.
There was not like, and we don't even talk about, you know, the Black church or, you know, how, you know, church in America has been affected with slavery or anything. We like Reformation is great, and that's kind of where we'll leave it. And I'm like, you know, we had church before the Reformation. I digress. But yeah,
Right.
yeah. But we no, there's not. We
That's-
didn't read
that's
one
true.
Black scholar, which is very disheartening as a Black Christian in seminary. Like,
Right.
I mean, you don't feel like our scholarship is worthy to be put on anybody's syllabus, but I digress. Hopefully they'll see this book and be like, yes, let's do it. So the last 2 questions, we've come to the end. I would like to say thank you for joining us. You have been an amazing guest. You have done an amazing job with your chapter, and your 2 books you have out, they are amazing as well. The essays and scholarships and everything you wrote, you're just a true scholar, and I really appreciate you, especially being a woman and a historian. Like, you're just so awesome. So thank you again for coming to hang with us for a little bit, my new best friend. So our
new
lesson,
best friend.
yeah, sure. I'll share with you. So what do you have coming up next?
Okay.
Where do you have coming up next, and where can everybody find you?
What do I have coming up next? I'm tired, y'all. Just in general. I mean, it's been and I say that I got too much coming up. But this summer, I'm really trying. You know, talking about books written. I'm working on another book on the history of Black travel. A history of Black travel, Black international travel that I've been working on for some time, and so I need to work on that. So this is summer for me. It's been an intense year professionally. You know, ministry wise, everything just it's been an intense year. And so I'm looking forward to a little bit of a break, actually, to focus on writing, which is great. But yeah, you know, I'm still just a girl who loves the local church and loves serving the local church. Shout out to Salt Women's Ministry, Tiffany Fellowship, and supporting that as I can. Working on some film and television consulting stuff, which has been a very interesting space for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I just really, like I said, and I'm going toward this study of really digging into the love of God and what it means to be God's beloved. And so I'm excited to discover what God has in store there. So yeah, but I also just want a little bit of rest this summer. I'm determined to learn how to Sabbath well. So that's what's next for me. Well, where you can find me, I mean, I'm on social media sometimes. I mean, I have social media accounts. I'm not the most active, but you can find me on Twitter and Facebook at Sable Facebook. See, I don't even know. Twitter and Instagram at Sable Victorian. And yeah, you can find me at Epiphany Fellowship Church if you want to email me there as well. And yeah, it's been a great evening talking with you ladies.
You too. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, we thank you for just pouring out into the book, into all of your prior interviews and stuff. I've been watching you for a very, very long time. I don't want to seem like I'm a stalker or nothing, but
I mean, you have better things to do. No,
I didn't. I've been watching you for a long time. I see you in an interview with Pastor Mason, and I was like, she's amazing. And then I see you on Jude 3, and I was like, she's still amazing. So I guess it was like, let me get her books and read some of these articles. And I was like, she's even more amazing than what I thought. So you have been just a blessing just, I mean, even if you don't know that, I just want you to know you have been a blessing to me just with all that you have contributed thus far. So I can't wait to see what you have coming up next. And some ladies on the screen need to understand what a Sabbath rest is as well. So thank you for saying
I knew you were going there. I knew.
And as long as you know who I'm talking about.
Amen. I concur.
As long as you know who you are. But no, thank you again. So you guys, thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight has been amazing. If you did not catch it from the beginning, make sure you watch the replay, share with everybody, purchase Dr. Tiffany Gill's books that she has available. And if you haven't purchased Urban Apologetics, make sure you purchase that too. So thank you again, and we'll see you guys on the next round. Peace.